Okay, so the term smart cities, I think a lot of people, when they hear it, they tend to think of very high-tech developed nations. But here we are today to talk about how digital solutions are helping emerging countries. So I wanted to start the panel by asking a couple of questions. Um, how exactly are these digital solutions helping in emerging countries? What are the characteristics of a smart city? And how can emerging markets collaborate with more advanced regions to accelerate the technology adoption? Maybe start with Marcelo.
Yeah, so hello everybody. Thanks for the invitation. Great to be here. It's the first time that I'm doing one of those fireside chats without the fire, but just sticking to chats. So congratulations and pushing forward and getting the message out there. Answering your question, what I usually tell people is that all cities are smart because the smarts are actually and the inhabitants. You just want to make sure that the way people interact with services in the city, they are not impeded by unnecessary frictions, and you can flow in terms of the information that is relevant at the right time in the right context. So if governments at municipal, state, and federal levels did nothing, cities will become smarter anyway through private initiatives. You're just going to have more apps and more solutions that people download because that's something that defined by themselves. They vote with their feet. That's something that they prefer to have as making their lives easier. What governments can do, and the United Nations and lots of other institutions, is really trying to make sure that the best products bubble up, that they get the right level of support and promotion. And we identify all those small processes, and it's really from the minute to the gigantic, but it tends to start with small steps. Which processes out of the myriad that I have out there have the greatest impact to the lowest investment?
Okay. Can you give us some examples of those?
Well, the best example that I usually share in this kind of conferences is that the city of Stockholm created an app, and lots of people started coming up with ideas on how the app could be used. And the smartest thing about the app is, in fact, uh, a sticker that you put on rubbish bins. I haven't been following the app for a very long time, but this is from 4 or 5 years ago. You'd go to smart city conferences and you have lots of companies trying to sell super smart rubbish bins that have a sensor with a radar that will tell you that it's half full. So you send a message to a central server and then the truck gets redirected. In Stockholm, apparently, they put a QR code on a sticker. They put the sticker on the rubbish bin. The citizens who are stimulated to be more engaged take pictures of the QR code when they notice that a bin is full, and that information goes into the server, and everything is smoother. So, counterintuitively, for me, the smartest thing out of the system is having the intelligence to crowdsource lots of efforts that minimizes the expenditure. And of course, when you have sensors inside, trash is going to get dirty, it's going to break, it's expensive to maintain, and it creates lots of supply chains that are completely irrelevant and necessary. The stickers are going to be there for years and it'll be functional without any maintenance required for all of those years. And you're stimulating your citizens to be more engaged and save money, right? You're basically telling them, if you don't take those pictures when the trash is full, your bill is going to be higher because you need to get trucks to go into routes that make no sense. And it's something that is so easy for you to do that if you don't, you kind of have no right to complain afterwards. So it's a nice, a positive catch-22 feedback loop that I appreciate very much.
Very, very
I think something Marcelo highlighted, and by the way, hello everyone. Marcelo, just I've never seen you look this sharp, and I like it.
I made an effort.
Yeah, you did. I appreciate that, man. I do. I think something subtle there that Marcelo said that I wanted to kind of like hone in on based on your question, which centered around emerging markets and how Marcelo was describing those garbage cans, basically or rubbish containers, basically from like a NASA project, which basically has like an antenna on it, which has all these gadgets associated with it, to the sticker, that really kind of encapsulates the same value proposition, same outcomes, just with more minimal maintenance and very low friction, kind of highlights how different regions approach smart cities. So I think that you find in North America, it's much more commercially focused, where large corporates have let's just call it more sway in terms of defining what procurement models look like, what's actually needed, what the purpose of that is, and generally operates in different silos. So the rubbish is different than the mobility, which is different than this. And those things have a tough time communicating with one another. While at the same time, they're very rich and very contextualized in terms of their technological superiority, in terms of the kind of call it gadget level. Whereas in Europe, where Marcelo was kind of just speaking to, more broadly speaking, whether it be Stockholm or other places, it's much more collaborative. It's much more about the collective. It's kind of built into their DNA, where these crowdsourcing of solutions and putting the money behind what the people basically crowdsourced as what they define as value really dictates what gets procured and what gets implemented. And then in Asia, in emerging markets, much more top down. So I find that similar to, or like Europe is similar to North America in the sense that there's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of like red tape, there's a lot of, it comes with its struggles. But with Asia, the beauty of it is it's very top down in the sense that federal speaks one way, that then travels to industry, and then that travels to the startup community. So it's all kind of contextualized in one kind of straight path. So for example, like if you look at, China's usually the example people use, but like let's say you have South Korea, where emerging technology like blockchain is part of, like, on a federal level, it's part of the national security mandate, right? So that means that industry can then like grip onto that. It's like, okay, this is where we're going to invest our money because this is where our national identity stands. And then all of a sudden they start educating people, they start producing pilots, they start putting capital behind different business units. The government then matches that investment with investment in different innovation parks, investment in different development communities, investment in the education system. And then startups then obviously see value in that to service cities because they know that there's going to be business there. They know there's going to be repetitive business there. There's going to be contracts there. So it creates this culture where everyone's kind of aligned. So that's where I see kind of emerging markets approach smart cities differently based on how much federal involvement there is, and then culturally speaking, how these kind of regions are built in terms of their collaboration models.
Okay, interesting. And so Marcelo, regarding the UN, how can they facilitate with more pragmatic solutions that are kind of adapted to the local needs?
I would split that into multiple segments. I think at the federal, national level, sometimes getting out of the way is the best thing they can do. I'll try to understand that legislation, and I'm not trying to come across as a libertarian here, but every time you add a new piece of legislation, it's kind of a brick that will come with another brick on top. And then it's much harder to remove older legislation, and it gets complex, and you end up in a situation where at the federal level, in most nations, you want to be extremely careful. You want to stimulate the innovation. You want to make sure that the funds are available, or you have certain types of subsidies or rebates, but it's never one solution fits all, because all politics are local. Like you may have the kind of situation where in some areas of a country, and I'm really talking about from micronations all the way to China, right? You're going to have different problems that need to be tackled. And when you're trying to create a framework, it needs to be as flexible as possible. So what tends to work quite well is allowing the municipalities to make certain decisions and concentrating where the higher levels of government, states, in the case of Switzerland, the canton, or the federal level. I live in Switzerland, so I'm more comfortable talking about the way things work here, and it so happens to be the most decentralized country in the world. And no wonder I've been working with blockchain since 2013, so I'm very comfortable around here. And you end up in a kind of context where, in our specific case, like here in the community where I live, a small village with 500 people, we kind of have more sheep and cow than people. And they decided to build a giant fire station because they didn't have one that was good enough for the number of people in the region. And all of a sudden, there was a discussion at the municipal level, and I said, okay, we want to increase the fire fee to an exorbitant level for a certain number of years to be able to invest into something that is going to last for another 20, 30 years. If you had the federal government saying you all must pay 20 times more in a fire fee because someone in the capital decided to do so, we would have been happy because we decided to do it anyway, but with everybody else. Right, so you need to make sure that the minimum standards are secured, that you enter into relationships and agreements with other countries where, kind of dialing back a little bit to discussion in terms of Sweden, I first talked about the sticker solution in Ukraine when we got invited as a small committee from the UN to talk to a group of cities in a very poor region. I mean, not the poorest, but definitely not at the level of the capital in Kiev. And we're just trying to tell them that, look, no, to make a city smart, they don't need to spend that much money. And of course, the sticker solution would never work without the app. The app would never work without a backend that was expensive to develop. But guess what? It has already been developed by the city of Stockholm. And the city of Stockholm and the region in Ukraine, they're not in the business of competing with one another. So it is utterly realistic to expect this group of cities in a poor region of the world to have an agreement with Stockholm where they open source the software. They have amazing developers in Ukraine to adapt to whatever conditions they need. Of course, the type of trash is going to be different, or the kind of illumination and the way the energy and heating is distributed. But the core software is already there. So I think that at a federal level, what could happen is that the governments of Ukraine and Sweden, they come up with an arrangement for saying which cities in Sweden have already developed technology that can benefit the poorer countries in the world. Ukraine took the lead, so the ones inviting the committee to go there to try to help out. They will do the first prototype implementation. Everybody. The UN looks good because they did the kind of ice-breaking and introduction. And the city of Stockholm is going to be seen as a technology leader, and the cities in Ukraine not only get the benefits of having the technology solution at maybe a tenth of the cost, because most of it is developed anyway, they get to be seen in the developing world as thought leaders as well. So this is what I would like to see federal governments doing more and more, defining frameworks.
One quick thing on that, because like the point of this talk is emerging markets leveraging emerging technology. And I think what Marcelo is kind of saying in one way or another is no city really has, not many cities have a technology problem. They have an accessibility problem, right? So the problem, like the US, for example, is rich in all different technology solutions. The problem is accessibility, because usually people selling the technology need buyers for the technology, right? You need people with disposable income to pay for the technology. And usually that means our most disenfranchised and marginalized neighborhoods don't have access to it, whether it be broadband or whether that be mobility solutions, whether it be mobility solutions that we know today, like public transport, or future ones like autonomous vehicles or something like that. And I think that what's how cities are going to kind of emerge out of what we're kind of experiencing today is less of focus on technology procurement and more innovation in policy. Because I think a lot of what Marcelo is mentioning is it takes not innovation in the technology, i.e. the city has a technology and you want to offer it somewhere else, but more innovation in a policy so the accessibility of that technology can easily, I guess, navigate more capitalist motivations and weave through that for the common good, which was the original intention. And right now, there's a lot of blockades and a lot of bottlenecks in place by virtue of more the capitalist side of smart city solutions. Because again, it's an industry, right? And by virtue of industry, that means you have to sell a widget, people have to buy the widget, and then that needs to somehow monetize in a way or at least break even. So that's why you see a lot of deserts of these technology solutions in any region, whether that be Asia, Europe, Latin America, or North America, just because that there's a company that sells it and it doesn't make financial sense to put it in places where the people can't actually afford it, or municipalities, or they're not going to spend time reaching out to small village municipalities because they don't have the budget that a New York City has, or a London has, or a Berlin has. So I think that if you kind of look at it less of a technology problem or challenge and more of a policy challenge. So basically, we need cities less to be our CTO, and we need them to be like our best lawyer. So I think that you're going to see a shift in terms of what the motivations are, and B, how they hire and what type of personnel for what purpose. And that in turn will spread the abundance of technology we already have, but also just in turn create better good for more people at the same time.
Okay, amazing. So you both touched on a couple of ideas. Mainly, the technology is there, but also that simple solutions are important. So where does blockchain fit into this? How is it changing the game? And also how many solutions have been implemented in 2020 with the current situation that you touched upon, Faris?
Yes, I mean, I think it depends on region. So a lot of the problem with implementation of blockchain, I would say on a city level, because usually cities are trying to address challenges that aren't adequately addressed on a higher level of government, right? They're kind of like the last stand. So a lot of the time they're just putting out fires versus like thinking, okay, what is our next 2 years going to look like, and how are we going to build towards that, right? They're just trying to like, just figure things out in the moment. A lot of the time, not their fault, but nevertheless, that's kind of the behavior. And the problem with cities is that they have an abundance of data, but they have a lot of scarcity around other things like budget and who's responsible for what and all those kind of things. So the biggest kind of impeding factor, I would say, of blockchain in cities, at least in the North American context, is education, because people don't feel comfortable with change. So you're not going to like change from a database solution to a decentralized solution if you're not adequately educated on what it means, what the impact is, what the costs are, how does that intersect with ongoing initiatives under my remit, under my colleagues' remits, and so forth. In Europe, I think you see a lot more money in experimentation. So putting out money to basically create more public-private partnerships where there's incentives to test out different decentralized solutions. So like in Vienna, for example, they have a whole decentralized solution around and tokenization model around reducing CO2 emissions by incentivizing people not to drive their cars into the city center, and in turn incentivize them through free access to cultural institutions, whether it be like opera or different monuments or museums, right? So they're creating a framework for that. Same in Helsinki, similar models. In Asia, they're looking at it more in terms of how do I reduce costs and optimize my my IT suite by creating blockchain solutions that reduce costs. Because in Asia, they're coming where we have a lot of low income people that are now rising to middle class, which basically means they have more digital demands, which basically stresses digital infrastructure from a municipal context. So they're adopting a lot of these blockchain solutions and more in sync with other levels of government.
I'm going to have to cut you off there. We're nearly coming towards the end of the session.
Okay.
I just wanted it went really, really fast. I just wanted to check in with both of you again about the current situation with COVID. Let's finish there. Do you think that has accelerated the need for automation? And if so, what are some of the easiest and fastest solutions that can be put in place?
I'll let Marcelo go on that one.
Yeah, if you read this week's Economist, you'll have an article that says that mobile transactions went up by a factor of 5 in Rwanda. Now, anything that requires you to touch stuff that other people have touched before, to have personal contact, or to put you in a situation of risk, already identified or to be identified in the future, is going to work as an incentive in terms of automation. So yeah, blockchain technologies, because they facilitate so many processes that are clunky and unnecessary by nature, they will get a big boost. And I would just like to make a quick note, because I know you're getting to the end of the session. When I was talking about Stockholm helping cities in Ukraine, that's the flow in one direction. What happens in the blockchain space is that many companies, because they have no track record other than the co-founders and investor back them, they need to have what in the 2000s used to be called the eyeballs, right? You want to make sure that you're reaching out to a massive audience. Blockchain technology does not necessarily require a huge amount of computing power, so even simple smartphones would be able to allow you to access many of those advantages or new systems. And that puts the poorer countries that do have a basic infrastructure, like India, for instance, where the bandwidth is actually very cheap, to serve as the platform that proves that those technologies have reached maturity. So you can have a pilot that works really well in Vienna, and the company that got close to nothing from the government, maybe a grant from the EU to run the pilot, needs then to go to a much less affluent society to get to the 100,000, to the million, to the 10 million users, which is basically the proof in the pudding. I mean, once you are capable of showing that millions of people benefit from your solution, those solutions can more justifiably be transported back to the more developed world. So blockchain turns things upside down.
How far away are we from that? Faris, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll just I'll bookmark it and we'll end on a high note. I think what Marcelo is kind of saying is also in the context of cities, the biggest hurdle is where have you done it before? And a lot of the problem with blockchain solutions in cities is that they haven't done it in many places, right? But that's more of a behavior from a municipal standpoint than it is a virtue of what blockchain technology is. So I think through education, that's where maybe you can leapfrog that resistance. In terms of COVID, I think that from looking at it through a city lens specifically, and like through an automation context, I think that you'll see cities focused on two distinct things in much higher order. One, I think revenue. So I think they'll be more kind of equipped to like, okay, how does this solution actually monetize? Which is not a kind of a default behavior from before, because now their coffers are pretty dry and all that. The second, from an automation standpoint, is that as we're seeing jobs go away, that's obviously stressing their infrastructure. It's stressing the cultural fabric of cities, most violently in the U.S. But the thing there, though, is I think that doubles down on how much they focus on policy to enable these automations to exist, while not leaving behind the workers that are essentially got displaced by the technology. So you create a construct where they have some kind of a dotted line into the productivity that the automation actually creates, versus being left on a desert alone and left stranded.
Brilliant. Thank you both so very, very much. There's obviously so much more that we could cover here, but we don't have time today. So really appreciate you being able to do this panel with me.
Anytime.